Okay, so welcome everybody and thanks for joining us this evening. And I thought I'd kick off first by sort of explaining what brought me to XR and why I got involved. And really, I suppose, the first thing to say is I'm one of the guilty people who probably has done more than most of you to actually cause the current climate crisis that we're in now. I used to have a job with a large global corporate company that involved flying around the world many times a year. And so I've certainly clocked up a large carbon footprint. And in fact, the company was involved in making a lot of plastics products, which themselves were made out of fossil fuels. I actually first of all came across Extinction Rebellion when a friend of mine took me to a festival in the UK. I'd just been made redundant from America and I was at a festival in the UK. And he said to me, well, come over and listen to this talk. It was in between various music acts, and we listened to a version of the talk that you're going to hear tonight. And then at the end of the day, they did something that really kind of surprised me. They went round to all the food trucks. If you've ever been to a festival, there's lots of kind of food stalls. And at the end of the evening, all these food stalls have food that's left over. It's just going to be thrown away. They collected it all together and they put on what they called a beggar's banquet. And anybody could just turn up and have free food at the end of the night and just chat to people. And I thought that was such a lovely way of making connections with other human beings and also helping to save the planet by sharing, preventing food waste. So I signed up to join Extinction Rebellion. The first rebellion I signed up, I was going to help build some power equipment, solar panels, that sort of things. Unfortunately, the police came and arrested them all, so they all got taken away. And then at the second rebellion I went to, I volunteered to be a steward. And that's what I've done ever since with Extinction Rebellion. I also get involved in media and messaging, that's kind of social media posts for Extinction Rebellion locally and in the southeast. Anyway, that's enough about me. Now let's hear about what we're going to be talking about tonight. So Extinction Rebellion, you're going to hear more about it as a movement later. But first of all, just one slide of introduction to stress we're a non-violent, direct action civil disobedience movement. We're everyday people, you and me, and we're trying to look for a solution to the climate and ecological crises. And we've recognised that individual action isn't enough. We need system change. There's going to be some things during tonight's talk that might make you feel uncomfortable, might make you feel angry, numbness. I've heard people who've watched this talk and sort of felt very sad at parts of it. It's perfectly natural to have those feelings, and we will have a couple of moments for reflection when we can talk in smaller breakout groups about what you've felt. If anybody is really uncomfortable, obviously stop, take a break, or message me afterwards and we can have a private chat about it. One positive thing about joining organisations like Extinction Rebellion, and I've certainly found this myself, is it actually can be quite therapeutic. Realising there are other people like you who share the same concerns, the same feelings, and give you some mutual support can be very therapeutic. So we're going to be hearing tonight about the environment, the ecological crisis and climate destruction, but it's important to think that they're all interlinked. There's all aspects of justice, and we can't solve one without the other. And powerful interests, unfortunately, are perpetuating these emergencies. The most pressing problems impact the people who usually have done least to cause them. The global south have done the least to cause the CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, but they are going to suffer the first and they're going to suffer the hardest from the consequences of it. Tonight's talk isn't specifically going to touch on these aspects of climate justice. We have other talks and presentations about those. So again, bring up questions about that at the end if you've got them. So there are two most important crises affecting the planet today. Overconsumption by the rich minority, and sadly that means all of us who are here on this call tonight, is causing them. There are plenty of other crises affecting us, plastics, pollution, particulates in the air that are impacting people's health. They're also important, but they're dwarfed in importance by these two. If we don't fix these, we don't have a planet to live on. And that's why Extinction Rebellion believes these are the two most important crises that we need to concentrate on. Governments know this, and yet they carry on as though it's not happening. A little bit about greenhouse heating. Again, I'm sure probably most of you have already heard this, already understand it, but I will just touch on the science. And the science has been around for a long time, well over a century. Basic physics and chemistry. The atmosphere that surrounds our Earth is a bit like a blanket, okay, keeping us warm but not too hot. And the Earth's atmosphere naturally contains some gases that we call greenhouse gases, most important being carbon dioxide. That's what we get when we breathe out or when we burn fossil fuels. There are other gases like methane and nitrous oxide, which also act as greenhouse gases, but they don't stay in the atmosphere for so long. And so carbon dioxide is the one that we all focus on. Now, the problem comes if you have too much of these greenhouse gases, and then your blanket becomes, instead of a nice jumper that's keeping you just about right, becomes a bit like a parka coat, and you're starting to overheat. If we didn't have any greenhouse gases, the Earth would be tens of degrees cooler. We'd be in an ice age. But unfortunately, humans burning fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution have been adding more and more greenhouse gases, and they've been warming it up. Climate scientists agree on it, but its lobbying from fossil fuel companies has created a false controversy over it. It's not being debated. By burning these fossil fuels for energy, we've been pumping out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at an unprecedented rate for the past 200 years. And carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for a very long time. Changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations last for thousands of years. So it keeps on accumulating. So let's look now at what all this carbon dioxide has actually done to the temperature of the Earth. So this slide here that you're looking at, the red line that sort of seems pretty flat and then suddenly shoots up, that's the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere. And you can see for thousands of years, it's been pretty constant, didn't really change very much. And then something happened in around 1880 to 2000. The Industrial Revolution happened, and we all started, well, first of all, burning coal, well, charcoal, then coal to generate steam, and then later on oil and gas. And we've been burning it at a faster and faster rate. And the blue line is the average Earth's temperature. And you can see at the end, since we've been measuring it, that it almost overlays the carbon dioxide level. There's a very, very strong correlation. Now, the problem for us all is that that carbon dioxide level has been increasing and increasing and increasing. Started out about 280 parts per million, but now it's over 414 parts per million and rising, and it's rising at an ever fastest rate. So that level that we're seeing now is the highest it's been in the last 3 million years. So just let that sink in. We have now created the highest levels of carbon dioxide for the last 3 million years. We've already reached 1.2 degrees C of warming above pre-industrial levels, and we're currently heading for around 3 degrees C of warming or more by the end of century. And to halt global warming, we have to stop the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and ultimately start to reduce it. But as I said, carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for thousands of years, so it's going to take a very long time before we can actually bring that temperature down. A couple of other points to sort of stress here. We can't predict the climate perfectly, and not every government is going to stick to the promises they've made. I mean, there hasn't been exactly a very good track record of sticking to the policies that they've made already. It's at the moment, as I say, we're looking like we're going to go to 3 degrees C, which is well above the 1.5 degrees C that was committed to, allegedly, in the Paris Climate Accord. And a 3 degrees C hotter world would be absolutely catastrophic. We'll come and see later in the talk this evening some of the impacts of that. So I now want to just explain with a simple analogy why reducing emissions isn't enough, why we need to get to what you might have heard of in terms of net zero. So if you look at this picture and think of the water already in the bath, that's all the carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere. And the running tap is the emissions that we keep pumping in. So that's the burning all the fossil fuels, put simply. So if you turn the tap down and you slow the amount of water going into the bath, that isn't going to stop the bath rising. It's just going to make it rise at a slower rate. The only way to reduce the amount of water in the bath is to turn the tap off and ultimately try and pull the plug out or drill some holes in the bath. In the lockdown year of 2020, we slowed the tap down by 6 to 7%. So, massive changes to society. Lots of people stayed at home. Air travel was really constrained, but we still added 93%. So that's almost all of the pre-lockdown year's carbon into the atmosphere. Net zero means stopping the bathwater rising any further. Making the amount that we put in equal to the amount we take out. We really need to go lower than that. But the first aim is to stop it getting any worse. So that's a very quick whiz through the climate crisis information. But of course, the climate chaos is only half of the problem. There's also the ecological crisis, caused in a large part by the climate crisis I've just been describing. Humanity is basically waging a war on nature, and human activity is causing a mass extinction of the other animal life on this planet besides humans. Our agricultural system is destroying vast tracts of forest and other natural habitats, particularly as the rich world demands an ever increasing amount of meat. So it's meat production which is causing the bulk of that issue. And this whole extinction is caused by exploding human consumption, not natural events. And that's why it's better called an extermination. The world has sadly failed to meet a single target to stop the destruction of nature. 75% of the Earth's land has been severely altered by human actions such as industry or farming. Only 13% of the world's oceans remain as wilderness, free from human influence and exploitation. Approximately 60 billion tons of renewable and non-renewable resources are extracted globally each year from our ecosystems. So that's nearly twice the rate it was in 1980. According to some studies, we're producing waste and overusing resources 70% more quickly than they can be absorbed or replenished. You might hear of a day called Earth Day, which is the point in the year when we've used up all the resources that are going to get replenished. Agricultural land now covers 50% of all habitable land, pushing non-livestock species to the margins. So the consequences of these two things, global warming and ecological destruction, I'm afraid they're dire. There's no other way of putting it. And they fit into 3 linked categories: climate, ecological, and human impacts. And we'll look at each of those in turn now. So the other thing that I want to kind of stress is the climate crisis is not something in the future. People think, okay, COVID, that's immediate, I've got to do something about it now. The war in Ukraine, that's something immediate, I've got to do something about it now. But the climate and ecological crisis is also something immediate that we have to do something about now. we're already at 1.2 degrees. If you look at these 4 pictures, just sort of take a moment and think what each of those could represent. What are the big impacts that we're seeing that's happening now already? Well, the top left-hand one is drought. You might think, okay, we're not going to get drought here in the UK. Well, parts of East Anglia, already get very little rain. And if the climate continues to increase in temperature, you could have desertification of parts even in the UK. Top right-hand one, flooding. Well, we've certainly seen flooding in the UK, more intense and more frequent extreme weather events, the unpredictability of the weather and the force with which those impacts happen. I mean, we had 3 named storms in the space of just over a week earlier on this year. Wildfires, again, we don't tend to think of mass wildfires in the UK, but I'm sure you've heard about them in other parts of the country. Truly horrific, thinking you've got parts of the Arctic actually on fire last year. Places that you imagine covered in snow. And the last one, okay, this will take slightly longer, but potentially has the biggest impact, and that's sea level rise. 2 chief causes. As water warms, it expands. So as the world's oceans get hotter, they're going to expand, they take up more space, and so the sea level rises. But an even bigger cause for that impact is the melting of the polar ice caps. Not the melting of the ice that's already floating in the oceans. So think of an ice cube in a glass. When that melts, the water doesn't change height. But where the ice is in a glacier or it's on land, so it's either in Antarctic or places like Greenland, when that melts, that raises the height of the seas around us. And lots of the world's major cities and population centres are very, very close to the coast, or very, very close to sea level. So there's places that we know of that by the end of the century, potentially could be underwater. A million species being at risk of extinction within our lifetime. And this is really the part of the talk that gets to me thinking, I mean, I don't know about you, I have children, and I think they're going to see a world with a lot less animal species in it than I did when I was their age, when I was growing up. When I first learnt to drive a car, so you'd go out go for a drive in a summer evening, and what was it that used to happen to your car? Yep, that's right. You'd have all sorts of bugs squashed all over the windscreen, in the radiator grill, all over the headlights. If you drive a car in the summer now, you just don't get that happening. Half of the world's insects have disappeared in the last 50 years. Just half of the world's insects have just disappeared. Species are being destroyed at 1,000 times the normal background rate of extinctions. So we're already in a mass extinction phase. Again, those of you that might have done biology back in the day when you were at school, you will have heard of the various different mass extinction events. We're living through one now, and it's already happening. If you look at all of the living things on the planet now, and we split it up, 60% of it by weight is livestock, 36% is humans. So together that's 96% of the weight of living things, is either humans or things we're deliberately kind of growing to eat. 4% is wild. Over 80% of the human diet is provided by meats. Is it provided by plants? But meat, aquaculture, eggs and dairy use over 80% of the world's farmland, despite providing only 18% of our calories. And meat production has tripled over the last 50 years. Deforestation of the Amazon is now occurring faster than 3 football fields a minute. So you can calculate how many football fields have disappeared while we listen to this talk. The Amazon is potentially, normally you think of forests as absorbing carbon. But the Amazon is in serious danger. It may have already switched from absorbing carbon to being a carbon source. As the Amazon is destroyed, it dries out, and dry Amazon actually gives out more carbon than it can absorb. So within our lifetime, the world's going to be a very, very different place. I want you to just sort of take a moment and imagine it's 2050, you know, that magic date when everything's going to be all right and we're going to have achieved net zero if the government reaches all its targets. And the world, imagine the world's 2 degrees warmer. Well, are you going to be alive in 2050? Just do the sums now. How old will you be in 2050? So add, what are we going to add now? Get everybody to do the maths. Add 38 years to your current life now. Or maybe if you think that will be past the end of your life, do you have a special young person in your life? How old will they be in 2050? Life, the way we're accustomed to thinking about it, will have ended. Billions will be living in unbearable heat. Billions of people will be chronically short of water. Hundreds of millions of people will be living with constant flooding and the inundation of their homes and cities. Miami, New York City, Tokyo, Dakar, Amsterdam may well become uninhabitable. And that's not that far away. We won't escape that damage in the UK. We'll have internal climate refugees because 2.6 million people will be living in areas with extreme flooding. Where are they going to go? Millions will starve to death because the crops in their lands will fail, and global food shortages are going to massively impact the UK. I mean, as a result of Brexit and other changes, I'm sure you've noticed shortages in the supermarkets. And the next time you do go to the supermarket, just look at where all your food comes from and imagine what climate change is going to do to those sources. All of the above, sadly, I fear is going to lead to conflict over those resources. So war, civil wars, riots, mass migrations of people, possibly even societal collapse. So I've just delivered you some quite sort of shocking information, and this ends the first part of the talk where we tell the truth about the climate and ecological crises. So I'm just going to suggest we pause for a moment and you just reflect individually on what you've just heard, on what it means to you. So we're going to come back now to thinking about, okay, we've heard about the crisis, but let's think what's actually being done about it. And the first thing, sadly to say, is traditional approaches don't work. If we look back at that original hockey stick graph and we look at all the things that governments have said they're going to do and when they're going to make changes, you know, that Greenpeace and other organisations have been going for hundreds of years trying to get governments to change their direction. We've been knowing that we were heading for disaster since 1990 at least. Despite all the international agreements, emissions are going faster. The world has emitted more carbon dioxide since the start of the COP series than in the whole of humanity before that point. It's not slowing down. Warm words from politicians, talking shops, thousands of legal cases, 50 years of environmental campaigning, and none of it has worked or even leveled off the CO2 concentration. You know, people have been environmental campaign groups have tried to make those in power take it seriously. There have been marches, petitions, actions. Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth have both been campaigning for over half a century, and the Sierra Club is over 100 years old. There's been over 1,000 legal actions against governments in 28 countries, and still that graph skyrockets upwards. COP has failed, I'm afraid. You know, even the most recent one, everybody is always very hopeful. The science is presented, warm words from the politicians, but nothing is done that's real, meaningful change. You know, we heard all these pledges from Boris Johnson, the G7, China and Joe Biden about lowering emissions. Every reduction is welcome, so we have to take the positives, but we can't be fooled into thinking that we're actually going far enough or fast enough to avoid disaster. If you look at this chart, it helps you understand, you know, where you are. So firstly, 1.5 degrees C, that was the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. But there's no hope that we're going to meet that. We're going to shoot well past it. The current targets that all of the world's countries have signed up to put us somewhere like 2.5 degrees, 2.4 degrees. It's well beyond the upper limit agreed at Paris. It's very clear the premises are not good enough. They've knowingly promised catastrophe. But what's most disturbing is the gulf between policies and actual practice. So sadly, although governments make promises, they don't tend to stick to them. And our current policies and actual practices put us somewhere between 2.3 and 4 degrees C. And even the low end of the policy range, which is unrealistically optimistic, is above the maximum stated in the Paris Agreement. Beyond 2 degrees, the world faces dangerous and irreversible damage, but that's the trajectory we're on. Governments make these net zero pledges while at the same time investing more in fossil fuels than renewables. Further investment in fossil fuels is incompatible with 1.5 degrees C, and it needs to stop immediately. Basically, governments are making the climate crisis worse, not better. In fact, governments are investing more in fossil fuels than clean energy. The G7 nations between January 2020 and March 2021 committed more than 189 billion to support coal, oil and gas, far more than clean forms of energy. And the UK government still spends more on supporting fossil fuels than renewable energy. In the City of London, UK financial institutions alone are responsible for more carbon emissions than the whole of Germany. If the UK financial institutions were a country, they would rank as the 8th largest emitter in the world. So we have to stop investment in fossil fuels. Carrying on as usual just isn't an option. Only structural change will work. So, you know, think about what the world needs to be like if we're really going to get to net zero, if we're really going to make the changes we need to make. The problem is carbon dioxide already pumped into the atmosphere. It's going to stay there for a very long time. Just carrying on as we are with little tweaks to the changes won't halt or even slow down global warming. Only rapid transformational change to the way we use energy, land and resources will do. To stand a reasonable chance of staying below 1.5 degrees C and allowing for extra dangers from tipping points and feedback loops, we need to reach net zero within 5 years, not by 2050, but by in fact it's 3 years, now 2025. Only structural change will halt global warming. And I want to just say something very quick about individual action. So, you know, we all make personal commitments to reduce our production of carbon. I'm pretty certain those of you on this call are already in the group who are trying to reduce your carbon footprint. That's great, but it's never going to be enough on its own because of all the emissions that we can't control as individuals. Our job is to get politically engaged to have an impact beyond our individual lives. We will never tackle the climate crisis with individual action alone, and we will never tackle the ecological crisis with individual action, even though those actions are important. The most CO2 is emitted on our behalf entirely out of our control. Electricity generation, airports, shipping, agriculture and heavy industry are all outside our control. Corporations and governments control those. So how did we arrive in this situation? And it's to a great extent the political system, the structure that we work in. So even if we imagine that politicians have their and our best interests at heart, the system that they're locked into doesn't allow them to take long-term decisions. Change needs to happen now, but the politicians can't bring themselves to make difficult decisions that might stop them getting re-elected. Usually election cycles in sort of 3 to 5 years. The belief of endless growth, but our planet is finite, so how can that work? And even though people all over the world want change, big oil and big money and press billionaires are actively lobbying against it. And all of those locked together cause the problem that we're in. So it's our electoral system. Any politician finds it really hard to think 10 to 20 years ahead. And then when they're elected, they're always looking for short-term solutions to justify them getting re-elected. The constant demand for economic growth and the citizen's voice has been incapable of forcing change. A tiny minority are gobbling up the planet's resources for their benefit, and the rest of us suffer. It isn't too late, but we have very little time. This is a mural on a wall in Islington. I haven't ever actually seen it myself, but I hope to one day. Maybe we'll get there in April. And if we can do nothing else, so if there's just one objective that you can keep in your head, stop fossil fuels from being extracted and used. It's the one simple thing, just stop fossil fuels now. Stop funding them, stop the corporations being funded that are extracting them, and stop their use. We need to do it rapidly, entirely, and forever. Everything else is secondary, because if we don't do that, we will fail. It's that straightforward. Personal action, lifestyle changes on their own will fail. So it's critical that our approach forces and convinces the powerful governments and international organizations and corporations to change. And that's exactly what Extinction Rebellion is here to do. And there is some hope. This is all very depressing, listening to the first part of this presentation, but it is possible to achieve change. And in a moment, we're going to look at a couple examples of changes that have happened if we look back in history. So it can be done. We need to do it now. We need to do it quickly. And that's why I and others in Extinction Rebellion rebel. Non-violent civil disobedience to bring about system change. If people fully understood the urgency, then Parliament squares across the world would be packed full of parents terrified for their children, and the daily newspaper front pages would carry climate emergency information exactly like they do with COVID. So we are Extinction Rebellion. We've been called the fastest growing startup in history. We have a plan, and yet there are no guarantees. We stand together, not because we're certain that we'll succeed, but because we have to try. I couldn't look my children in the face at the end of all this and say I didn't do anything. We feel we're left with no choice to rebel because all other avenues have been exhausted. People around the world understand there's a problem and are beginning to grasp the scale of the change needed. But we need to act. And if we don't act now, when? And if it's not going to be you, who's going to do it? We all know we're driving towards the cliff edge. We all understand the catastrophic risk. We all know powerful vested interests are in charge, and our representatives who say they're working on this are actually killing the planet. We all know it's a moral imperative, a real duty to act. I know it's uncomfortable, but Extinction Rebellion, the rest of us, we invite you to step out of your comfort zone to do things you haven't done before. Traditional political engagement doesn't go far enough when the system is failing so obviously and catastrophically. Rebelling is the only solution. So how might we succeed? Well, there's been quite a history of civil disobedience, non-violent direct action. And the key point here is, it's the non-violent part of that direct action. Look at some of these movements that have happened in the past. It's a long tradition of campaigns which have chosen non-violent direct action. Suffragettes, Mahatma Gandhi, Rosa Parks. It's also been called civil disobedience. It's important to include to be based on non-violence, because that helps to build a big, diverse mass movement. Size is crucial, and being non-violent lowers the barrier of entry for other people to join. It's much easier to imagine joining a peaceful movement than it is to imagine joining a violent movement. The larger, more diverse movements are more likely to succeed. Violent movements tend to be filled with young, able-bodied men. But diversity is crucial because we want to be inclusive and open to the whole population. Young, black, old, white, people of colour, able-bodied and disabled. The more representative we are, the more likely we are to be accepted and supported by wider society. Mass movements through non-violent direct action can create serious disruption, and that creates publicity, stopping business as usual and pushing regimes toward change. For success, we need to be long-lasting and we need to build in resilience. The disruption puts pressures on government. They sadly do not listen to movements if they do not cause disruption. Our instincts, on the other hand, as good citizens, are generally to obey the law as individuals. But in order to get people's attention, you have to be disruptive. Quietly offering leaflets in a shopping centre hasn't worked. Being compliant hasn't worked. Filling in petitions and sharing it on Facebook and social media channels hasn't worked. So historically, for disruption to be successful, it's meant people putting themselves in other people's way. Not just temporarily, but in a protest march, which disappears, but in lasting ways, such as roadblocks, boycotts, strike action, hunger strikes. It generates publicity and it makes people take notice. They literally cannot continue with business as usual. And the other thing we're often challenged on is that the protest needs to be focused where the power is. So here in the UK, that's in London, where government, the banks, and the climate obfuscating so-called think tanks are based. And the resistance needs to be prolonged. Change doesn't occur overnight, and so a movement needs to build resilience, or it will fizzle out, as we saw with the Occupy movement, for example. So Extinction Rebellion follows in the footsteps and learns from every great moral movement that has advanced the cause of justice, from India's independence movement to women's suffrage, the abolition movement, civil rights movement, anti-apartheid movement, LGBTQ movement. Every single one has met with sustained resistance. And just like those movements, we seek the tipping point where positive change not only becomes possible, it also becomes inevitable. So we've got three big, clear demands. First, to tell the truth. Government and media have to tell the truth about the situation we're in. That's the information that I shared in the first part of this talk. Although Parliament and many local governments have declared a climate and ecological emergency, they failed to communicate the scale and urgency of the crisis. Second, we demand that governments must act now to halt biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero as soon as possible, and in any case within 5 years. In a just way, today, not at some nebulous future time. And third, we demand a culture of participation, fairness and transparency. The government must create and be led by citizens' assemblies on climate and ecological justice. Only the common sense of ordinary people will help us navigate the challenging decisions ahead. So we are having some success. It's started to make a difference. Over the time that I've been part of Extinction Rebellion, there's been a big shift in the attitude of the UK public. 81% of them now say we're facing a climate emergency caused by human actions. We've definitely drawn much needed attention to the crisis, and people are beginning to understand the government isn't telling the truth and we have to act now. On juries, citizens have started to accept the case that's made. In the 1st of April 2019, rebels went to the headquarters of Shell Oil. They poured fake oil and glued themselves to the windows. They did this because reports had shown that Shell did know over 30 years ago about the terrible effects of carbon emissions on the climate. Shell hired lobbyists to try and cover it up, mislead the public, to block action on fossil fuels for decades. And Shell has also played a role in terrible crimes, such as the mergers of the Ognoni 9 in Nigeria. So the jury, fellow citizens, delivered its not guilty verdict for each of the Extinction Rebellion defendants. Despite the judge ruling, they had no defence under the law. So the power of civil disobedience in getting the public onto our side by shining a spotlight on justice, by telling the truth, we believe that people will understand why we are rising up and join us to bring about change. Extinction Rebellion is beginning, as I say, to have some success. A vast number of protests in the UK and globally, being a key influencer at COP, and 75% of UK councils declaring a climate emergency. But we need more people to make this work. In 2.5 years, we've compelled legislation and shifted the whole public discussion, but we need more people to join us to accelerate the pace of change. The fact that you're here and you're listening to me today means you're probably already sympathetic to the cause. But your children, your grandchildren, as well as the people already needlessly and unjustly suffering and dying because of climate tragedies today, they all need you to go beyond being sympathetic. They need you to go beyond lifestyle changes and recycling. They need you to join Extinction Rebellion and to get active. So don't leave it for another day. Just like with the climate, every day matters. Many people in this room, I'm sure you're already making change in your own lives. And don't stop that. Sends a message, creates markets, it does make a difference. But the change we need will come from non-violent direct action. It will come from pressure on governments and organisations. We need to push governments to end huge fossil fuel subsidies. And it will come when those fossil fuel companies are forced to leave the resources in the ground. We can't be sure what will work, but this is our best chance. And we're already having far more success than has been achieved by traditional campaigning. We're a very broad-based movement. And I want to stress that there's a place in XR for you. There's community groups based on faith, profession groups from lawyers to truck drivers, ethnicity groups, sexual identity groups, and interest groups from cricketers. There's even XR beekeepers. There's an XR grandparents and elders, XR yogis, XR social workers, XR plumbers, XR doctors, XR scientists, as well as local geographically based groups. I can promise you there is a group within the Extinction Rebellion family just for you. We're going to be back on the streets on Saturday, the 9th of April, with the biggest civil resistance campaign the UK has ever seen. So please get ready to be part of this whirlwind of change. And I will post into the chat at the end of the discussion, a copy of the Extinction Rebellion strategy that shows how our rebellion fits into the overall strategy, the specific things you need to do to prepare to be ready to join the next rebellion, and our request to you tonight: make that commitment that you're going to do something to help support Extinction Rebellion. So many ways to get involved. Whatever your skills and interests, there's a role for you. From leafleting, going and talking to other people, knocking on doors, trying to get other people to listen to talks like this, holding house meetings, helping with finance, sending messages to your MP, doing design, stewarding, there you are, the role I do, protesting businesses, doing research if you're legal, all sorts of different roles and jobs that need doing that make the overall rebellion happen. Ultimately, we're a movement that's trying to do something powerful. And amongst the many important roles, one key component of nonviolent direct action is having some people who are prepared to be arrested. There's no pressure to make this choice, and we make sure there's lots of training for anybody who's considering it, so that arrest is an informed choice. Carefully and consciously breaking the law is a key part of our strategy for success. And equally, supporting those people who have made that choice is equally important. They can't go through the arrest process without a large number of people around them supporting them and enabling that to happen. Don't let this be you. Don't look back and regret that you missed the opportunity to make a difference before it was too late. So in conclusion, how to join in. As I say, I will post these links at the end of the talk, but the best way is to join us on the streets on April the 9th. Thank you for listening.